If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. We have new stories every day. Let's go. My wife and I sometimes play poker with our friend Chris. It's not a regular thing, but we manage to play a few times a year. Recently, our wives went on a shopping trip together, which gave us the perfect opportunity to play a few hands. My wife Janet has a sister and a brother. On that particular evening, her brother Christian Nelson invited David Phillips to join our game at Chris's. Chris was on my left and David was on my right. Both David and Chris are lawyers at Nelson Preston and Peterson, the most successful law firm in the area. Janet's father, Jacob, was one of the original partners. Years ago, he bought out the other partners. So the firm is now entirely controlled by the Nelson family. Janet and her sister Peggy, who is known as Peg to the family. Janet was stuck with me, Jerry Parker. I was Irish, and I wasn't a lawyer, which caused quite a bit of family drama. If it weren't for her mother, Sally, taking an inexplicable liking to me, I never would have survived. I got a lot of criticism from my old man and his son, Chris. I was a mason working with brick, mortar blocks, and concrete. My dad had been one before me, and I never wanted to do anything else. He wanted me to go to school to learn the trade, but I resisted at first. My dad could lay block across the entire state and back, staying within a quarter of an inch of square and level. I figured I needed to learn from him, but I thought there was more to it. There was. After 2 years of school, I joined my dad in his business. My education allowed us to improve our materials and mixtures. I seized every opportunity to modernize and mechanize our operations. I introduced my dad to new, faster methods for building with brick and block. While he taught me the difference between slapping up masonry and true craftsmanship, we learned how to maintain the quality of our work while completing it more efficiently. The business expanded, and we hired 3 men to keep up with the increasing workload. At 27, I was a partner in a thriving enterprise. When I met Janet, we faced an issue with a supplier who took our deposit but didn't. I went to the Nelson law firm to see what our options were. Janet, who was 26 and the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, was assigned our case. She handled it really well, and we got our money back without going to court. By then, I was completely infatuated with her. Every time a payment was late or an order was late, I tried to convince my father that we needed Jerry. I really need your help with this. I was laying blocks for a huge house in the Poconos with my father one afternoon, when he suddenly said, "Why don't you just ask her out on a date? It would save me a ton of money and help me maintain good relations with our customers and suppliers. We can't sue every Tom, Dick, and Harry we do business with." I was taken aback, but I could see his point. I was taken aback. Did he really think I just wanted to see Janet again? How could he know what I was thinking? Was it that obvious? You must think I'm blind. My father laughed. It's pretty clear the girl has you all wrapped up. I was the same way with your mother, but I didn't need a flimsy excuse. I kept after her until eventually she gave in and married me. My father said, "She's a lawyer, you're just a mason." He thought she wouldn't be interested in someone like me. He was wrong. She definitely wasn't interested in a guy like me. She definitely wasn't interested in a weir. My father shot back, "You'll understand what women really want. I may not be an expert, but I know one thing. You are an excellent mason. You're possibly the best I've ever seen. You don't need to apologize to anyone, man or woman, for making an honest living with your hands. She probably deals with enough smooth-talking backstabbers and might be tired of them. Be confident, ask her out, and don't act like you're inferior. If she says no, try again in a week. It took me 2 months to get your mom to agree to go out with you. I spent the rest of the week thinking about what my father had told me. It's funny how your perspective changes over time. On Friday, I waited in the car park for Janet to finish work. I was still in my work clothes, sweaty and covered in dust. I'd decided to ask her out, and knew that if I went home to clean up, I'd lose my nerve. "Hello, Janet. I don't know if you remember me, but I'm Jerry Parker." Janet interrupted with a laugh. "Of course I remember you, Jerry. Are you having another issue with your suppliers?" "Actually, I'm having trouble thinking about anything but you, Janet." I admitted, "Would you like to go out to dinner or see a movie with me?" "I hope you will. At least take a shower first." He hadn't noticed her brother Chris approaching from behind. He had heard the entire conversation. "I thought that was private. So, are you really going out with this hardworking guy? Maybe he'll treat you to McDonald's and a documentary about the Hoover Dam. If he so much as touches you, we'll know." "Your fingerprints are all over you," he said snidely, from his looks and comments. I quickly figured out he was Janet's brother. Resorting to physical confrontation would have been a mistake, so I decided to salvage some pride by walking away. Just then, I remembered my father's advice. "Janet, will you go out with me?" I repeated it. Janet glanced from me to her. Smirking, she took my hand and pulled me aside. "Walk with me for a bit," she said. "Jerry, we don't need this jackal dropping on our conversation, do we?" she added rhetorically. We walked across the lot to a small park, where she sat on a bench and gestured for me to join her. "Jerry, you just met my brother Chris. I love him, but he's snobbish and My dad is pretty much the same whenever guys come to our house to take me out. The two of them act like jackals. If I agree to go out with you, they expect to ridicule and insult you. No one who takes me or my sister Peggy out is ever good enough. Janet, ask yourself if I'm telling you this because I'd love to go out with you, but I don't want you to suffer because of my family. If you've changed your mind after meeting Chris and hearing about my family, I'll understand. 000, it'll be okay." I asked that, and it marked the beginning of a challenging courtship. Her brother and father were the most unpleasant pair I'd ever met. They did everything they could to discourage me, but I kept coming back because I was deeply in love with Janet. We married just over a year and a half later. It took some time, but even old Jacob and Chris eventually accepted me. Having our 2 children, Sharon and Earl, certainly didn't hurt my standing in the family. It's funny how even the most difficult son and Janet's mom Sally was my biggest supporter from the start. I never knew why, but I was grateful for her kindness after 17 years of marriage. Sally treats me like a son. Janet's cousin usually came fourth in our card games, but he couldn't make it this time. Chris had invited David, which was a problem. David had a bad case of verbal diarrhea and an exaggerated sense of his charm with women. David was Chris's best friend and had even dated Janet a few times before she went to law school. He was a real nuisance to me during the 6 months I spent in Montrose. I slept with at least 10 different women. David boasted that 7 of them were married. There's just something exhilarating about getting involved with another man's wife. David, that sounds pretty risky. Eddie said you could end up getting shot or tangled up in lawsuits. It could ruin your reputation if you're not careful. David laughed and said that bad boy image actually boosts business. Men are intimidated by me, but women are intrigued. They see me as macho and seek my counsel. You might target the wrong woman, though. Eddie warned that she could report you to her. If you bothered a married woman, you'd be kicked out on the spot. Jacob won't be in charge for much longer, David said. Chris will take over soon, and he won't pay any attention to baseless allegations from jealous husbands. Chris, I do my best for you, David said. But it's not a good idea to put yourself in that position. My sisters will also have a significant say in firm decisions, Chris reasoned. Then I suppose I'll have to charm them into agreement. David grinned. I threw my cards on the table and stood up. I'm done with this game and this arrogant jerk. Wrong way. I'll rip your heart out and shove it down your throat. Chris and Eddie both stood up to calm me down. That's just David's sense of humor. Chris soothed. Don't take it personally, Jerry. He didn't mean anything by it. The hell I didn't, I snarled. David, you can't expect a bricklayer to understand or satisfy women. They prefer men with power and of warfare, if you even know what that means. Pompous weasel, I said. I set my piece, stay away from Janet. I'm not shaking cement, boy. I've decided to accept your challenge in a few weeks. I'll be in bed with your wife. David predicted that by the time I'm done, she'll have forgotten all about you. I started to walk around the table, but Chris and Eddie quickly intervened. He's just trying to provoke you, Eddie said. Janet wouldn't give him the time of day, he added. And you know it. Don't let his mouth and your temper land you in a world of trouble. Well, screw you too, Eddie shouted. David, just for that alone, I'm going to sleep with Peg. I'm going to show those two how a real man knows how to pleasure a woman. David was practically foaming at the mouth. His eyes were wild as he spoke, darting around like a cornered animal. I grabbed Eddie's shoulder to hold him back. I wasn't sure he could handle David, and frankly, if things got out of hand, I wanted to deal with that bastard myself. Chris announced, "The game is over. Eddie and Jerry, you need to leave. We need to calm down." Chris was right. We need to take a step back. It's his house after all. If someone asked me to leave their place, I'd respect that. When I asked Stone to leave mine, they needed to be out the door before I finished my drink. A man's house is his castle, as the saying goes. Eddie and I made our way to the door. Eddie was still muttering under his breath. I wasn't any happier. David was a miserable prick. I decided not to tell Janet about the whole affair until things settled down and I could figure out my next move. One thing was for sure. I'm sure David will regret causing trouble for my family by Monday evening. Janet met me at the door with a cold beer and a lot of questions. I heard you left the card game early on Saturday night, Jerry. Why was that? I'm terrible at lying, and I've thought about it a lot. I decided to just tell Janet the truth. She's smart and can handle herself. Chris asked both Eddie and me to leave. I said there's more to it than that. Janet asked you, didn't she? Did you threaten David? I told him to stay away from me, didn't I? I consider it a warning, not a threat. Janet, no one is going to talk about sleeping with my wife while still breathing. I replied calmly. I'm sure David didn't use those exact words. Janet said he told her all about how hostile you were to him. He thinks you're still jealous because I dated him long before I met you. And Chris basically agrees with David's version of events. You lost your cool and overreacted to an innocent comment, didn't you? For some reason, Chris is so wrapped up in David's world that he can't get enough oxygen to feed his brain. They both seem to think your father is ready to step down from the firm. It seems that Chris will be the next in line to run the company with David by his side. They're even talking about Chris's sisters and other people he can bring in. That's basically what they were discussing. I responded, Jerry, I know that's not accurate. Peg and I will have a say in any decisions regarding the company, and Chris knows it. David must know that as well. Janet reasoned that's why he's trying to manipulate you and Peg into seeing things his way. He seems to believe that once he gets involved with the Nelson girls, they'll honor his requests just for another chance. It seems like your fate is already sealed, at least in David's mind. Jerry, Chris's mind. He would never condone those words or actions from David. Jan replied indignantly, You're blowing everything out of proportion. I never knew you to be this jealous. I put my hands under Janet's arms and lifted her so her face was very close to mine. Janet, I love you more than you'll ever realize, I said. I will never tolerate any infidelity, and I will never stand by and allow that to ruin my family. Don't make any mistake about that. I understand why you might think Chris and David would have the sense not to say what I told you. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt because Chris is your brother and you love him. Just don't fall for David's trap. I warned you that you're such a big, strong man holding a little girl like me up like this. Do you think I'm afraid of? Janet laughed suddenly. I know you love me completely and will never hurt me. The kids are at my mom's tonight, so I suggest you either put me down or show me why I don't need another man if you're up to it. She would annoy me with all kinds of ridiculous stuff, and then suddenly ask me to make love to her. I think it was her way of ensuring I would listen to her and keep her happy. It always worked. I carried her into the bedroom and made her realize I was all the man she could ever need. At least that's what I believed. She reinforced my conviction that I couldn't love her any more than I already did. I knew that for sure. Over time, I realized that Janet rarely mentioned David, which bothered me. She worked with him every day, so why wouldn't she talk about him? My bond with my brother. After the heated card game incident, Eddie's bond with David became stronger. Eddie was really angry that David would insinuate that Peg might be unfaithful. Whenever Eddie and I met, we discussed David's actions and speculated about his intentions and associations. Eddie told me that he had enlisted Nancy Wall, old Jacob's secretary, to keep a discreet watch and report anything suspicious. He even explained to Nancy why he was so interested in the workplace dynamics. Fortunately, Nancy had no fondness for David Phillips and was more. Nancy hadn't reported anything out of the ordinary so far. This lack of intel only made me more anxious. I shadowed Janet closely and showered her with attention, which she seemed to appreciate. She rewarded me multiple times in the evenings. The family had organized a grand celebration for Sally and Jacob's 50th wedding anniversary. It was to be a full gathering with all the kids, grandkids, cousins, nieces, nephews, and other family members. An Irish family party requires a doctor's note. Janet and Peg have been handling most of the arrangements with some help from Chris and his wife Bridget. Chris met Bridget during a summer when she was temping at the firm. No one ever questioned Bridget's standing within the family, unlike the scrutiny Eddie and I faced when we first started courting. Chris's sisters seemed to have more weight in the Nelson family than Eddie concerning Powell. I never quite understood the reasoning behind it. The party was scheduled for Friday, July 15th, which was also the date of Jacob and Sal's golden anniversary. I could see that Janet was getting more and more stressed as the day drew closer. She spent a lot of time at her parents' house and on the phone, making sure that everything was in order. This was a trait that made her an excellent lawyer, and she carried her thoroughness into everyday life to avoid any surprises. It was noon on the Friday of the party when I received a call from Eddie, Jerry, and Nancy. She'd overheard David on the phone arranging to meet someone at the Tuck Him In at 3:12 a.m. Eddie said he doesn't know where Peg is. If he calls and says she's she'll just tell him she's anywhere. Do you know where Janet is? She said she had some last-minute errands, like picking up flowers. I'll tell the guys I'm leaving early and going to the motel before 3. I'll keep you posted. I told Eddie I would. He said he'd be at the coffee shop near his office. Can you pick me up on your way? The problem was that it wasn't on my way. It was already past 2. Picking up Eddie would eat into precious time. Still, he had been keeping me informed, so I was grateful for that. Eddie, just make sure you're ready to jump in when I pull up. We can't afford any delays, I replied, hanging up and hurrying to my truck. I arrived at the coffee shop at 10:03 and picked Eddie up. I acknowledged him with a nod. I quickly merged back into traffic. It was going to be tight. I parked in a convenience store lot next to the motel at 1:03, putting us in a good spot to keep an eye on the rooms. It was an older place with about 20 units, all facing the lot in front. I turned off the engine. There he is, Eddie said. He looks pretty cheerful, doesn't he? David was whistling as he approached a room. He swiped the key. I went inside and closed the door. Eddie turned to me and silently asked what we should do next. I thought about the situation. Should we confront the guy? What if he was with a woman who wasn't related to us? What if she hadn't arrived yet? We hadn't thought this through properly. I didn't want to do anything rash and end up in jail. Eddie, I reasoned. Let's wait and see who else shows up. Chances are that if any damage has been done, it was too late already. That's exactly what I was thinking. Eddie agreed. This probably isn't David's first fight. I hope it isn't one of our wives. We sat there for what felt like 15 minutes waiting for something to happen. Finally, David emerged, closed the door behind him and walked back to his car as he sped away. Eddie and I continued our vigil. A few minutes later, the door opened again and a woman stepped out. Out, bastard, Eddie blurted out, as we watched Janet quickly make her way around the side of the building. My heart pounded so intensely it was almost deafening. We both knew my life was falling apart. Jerry let Peg talk to Janet. Okay, Eddie urged. She can't really like that jerk. It was just a horrible mistake. I bet she already regrets it. She'll well, I growled, firing up the engine, and as we drove away from the car park, Eddie was still trying to calm me down. When we arrived at his office, I asked him, if the roles were reversed, what would you do? He replied, I'd do something impulsive and regret it later. I told him, you're smarter than that, Jerry. Think about the kids. If not for yourself, why didn't Janet think of the kids? He shot back, I'll handle this. My way was to grab a cold beer and chill out. I pulled into a local bar and downed a couple of beers. No brilliant solutions came to mind. I realized I wasn't the clever type. I just put my head down and charged forward. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but it was my way. I suddenly realized the full significance of Janet in my life. She was more than just someone I slept with, though she was great at that. She was my friend, my reason for living. I felt utterly alone, and my heart was aching like never before. My cell phone rang. It was Janet. Jerry, where are you? You're supposed to. By now it's after 5, and everyone's wondering where you are. I thought about telling her to go to hell, but decided against it. What better time to confront her and let her whole family know what kind of person she really was? That would give her father, Jacob, something to chew on. I was too late to change out of my work clothes, but I didn't care if the Nelsons were offended by a working man. I might as well have ruffled their feathers. I found myself in the backyard of Janet's parents' estate. My jaw was clenched and my temper was rising to boiling point. David's Mercedes was parked at the curb, got my goat. This party was about to get interesting. Jerry said, let's have a drink, my treat, Eddie called out before I could find Janet or David. It was clear he wanted to intercept me, trying to pacify my rising anger, but I wasn't having any of it. I ignored him and continued around a corner of a house. That's when I bumped into Sally. She said, I'm so glad you're here. The party wouldn't have been the same without you. She gave me a hug and kissed me on the cheek. Sally was one person I never wanted to hurt, but I was about to unleash a storm inside me. When I did, I saw David at the bar, chatting away and waving his drink around. I went over to him, and he noticed me coming. He put his drink down and faced me as I got closer. I warned you, you miserable prick. Now it's time to pay the piper. Out of nowhere, his right fist crashed into my chin. My head snapped back and I felt a disturbing crunch in my neck. I shook it off and smiled darkly at David. "So Janet told you everything?" David snarled. I knew they couldn't keep her. I was about to speak when his right hand connected with the left side of my face. The impact reverberated in the otherwise silent yard. I wasn't particularly close to the Nelson family, but Janet was close to David. He had just insulted her at her own family's event, rubbing my cheek. It dawned on me that David clearly I didn't realize how important the honor code was in real Irish business. I grabbed him by the lapels and slammed him against the nearby tool shed with such force that I wondered if the structure might collapse. I propped him up with my left hand and pulled back my right fist, ready to end this. It was Jerry. It wasn't exactly a yell. It was more the serious tone she reserved for grave offenses. Instinctively, I stopped, my fist hovering ready to obliterate David Phillips's smug face. "Janet, I'll deal with you later. I'm kind of dizzy." Suddenly, Janet stepped in front of me, pressing her hand against the arm still propping up David. "Deal. I'm going to have a word with you later, Jerry. I don't know what you think you're saying, but you'll have to deal with me right now. This guy just admitted everything." "Not that it matters," I added. "I saw you leave that goddamn motel today." Janet flinched as if she'd been struck. She raised her chin, meeting my gaze. "If you think I'd ever betray you for this, go ahead and beat me. I deserve it. If I did what you say I did, slap me around." I'd never seen her so emotional. Her lip quivered, her voice wavered. She knew she could cut my heart out and I wouldn't lift a hand against her. But I had a feeling that if I really trusted him and loved him like I thought I did, he'd let him go and let me explain. If I meant so little to him that he'd throw me away over something he thought might have happened, then he could go ahead and clobber him. He could even smack me around because any woman who would cheat on a husband as loyal and devoted as you deserves no better, she thought. I was really between a rock and a hard place. David was starting to recover and squirm. If I was going to deck him, I needed to do it now. But what if Janet hadn't cheated? What if there was another explanation for her being at that motel? I looked at Janet and realized I had no choice. I couldn't give up on her. I couldn't refuse her anything. She still stirred feelings in me even after all these years. I released David. My head snapped back as he swung a haymaker over Janet's shoulder, connecting with my left eye. It made my knees turn rubbery. I heard Janet. I heard a curse and the unmistakable sound of fists on flesh. I'd been around enough fights to know what that meant. Janet's arms wrapped around me and helped me stay upright as I staggered back, shaking my head to clear it. I realized my vision in my left eye was blurry, but I didn't need perfect sight. I saw Chris Nelson beating the daylights out of his former best friend, Eddie, and a couple of cousins rushed in and pulled Chris away from David. Chris was panting heavily, and his face was a deep shade of red. He rubbed his hands over his face and took a deep breath. "Get this cowardly fool out of here and do it now," he said. "It's fast. If he's still in my sight in 10 seconds, I can't be held responsible for what I might do," he shouted. Several hands grabbed David, half dragging and half carrying him out to the front. Chris put an arm over my shoulder and wrapped the other around Janet's waist, guiding us toward the kitchen. Inside, a few people we were watching through the open door, and Chris asked if we could have a few minutes. So, Janet, Bridget, and I went into the kitchen. Chris closed the door behind us. Janet told me that Chris had stopped her from making a mistake today. I was angry with her, but I respect her. "I admire you for coming clean. I can't believe I thought that guy was my friend while he was trying to seduce my wife." "Thanks, Janet," Chris said, his voice thick with emotion, hugging his sister tightly. I was still dazed from David's blows and struggled to understand the situation. David had slept with Bridget as well. What had Janet did that? Chris let go of Janet and gave me his hand. We were all a bit confused, so I took it, and we shook hands. "I owe you an apology, Jerry. I should have taken your perspective more seriously and fired David after that card game Eddie mentioned. I didn't know she went there to confront him. Bridget, don't get involved with that guy." Chris explained, obviously. Bridget listened to her and left. I assumed Janet stayed to deal with David. Peg and I both felt David's seductive attempts, but we had already discussed his outburst the night you and Eddie left. Chris, we could barely hide our... We then noticed that he shifted his focus to Bridget when she left early today. I had a bad feeling and followed her. Janet revealed that Bridget was long gone when David showed up. I negotiated his departure with him, and he agreed to announce tomorrow that he found a better position in California and would give his 2 weeks. Janet said that the firm wouldn't pursue any of his ethical violations. She also admitted that she didn't realize Jerry saw me leave the motel. That's why he was so furious at David. I said, I messed up again. Janet, when will I learn to trust you? I embarrass you in front of everyone. I fret about it. I'd hardly say that it laughed. Sally, Janet's mother, walked into the room, followed by Eddie, Peg, and my 2 kids. Everyone thought you were about to kill that guy if Janet hadn't stepped in. Phillips would be looking for his head right now, and the cops would be looking for you. Not that you didn't have a good reason, Jerry. If someone insulted my Janet in front of me, I'd be just as furious. I'm proud of Janet for marrying you. I'm also proud of her for stopping you from seriously hurting that idiot. Sally chuckled. I had a feeling you'd calm down once Janet got involved. I always had the same effect on her father. You went all soft and calm. When she came near, didn't you worry that I'd kill David? Your mom asked Chris, son, you did what you had to, but let's be honest. You're a lawyer. Your hands aren't lethal weapons. Look at Jerry's hands, chest, and shoulders. Phyllis was in real danger for a second there. You gave him a few bruises, but it'll be fine in a few days. What about Jerry? His eye is swollen shut, and there's a nasty bruise on his cheek. Any suggestions to ease the swelling? I only then realized my left eye was completely shut and my head was throbbing. Janet, take your husband upstairs, get him undressed and into the jacuzzi. Send up an ice pack with one of the kids, then get yourself undressed and show him how much you love him. We'll still be partying when you come back. Sally grinned. Mom shrieked. Peg, is that any way to talk to your daughter, especially in front of her children? Peg, don't get all prim and proper with me. It's important for kids and grown children to understand a few secrets to a lasting marriage. It definitely isn't by withholding love and affection, especially when your husband's been beaten defending the family. Less than an hour later, Janet and I rejoined the party and mingled with the guests, seemed to know about Sally's advice for a long marriage and teased us, making sure we followed her advice. I think Sally found a way to succeed thanks to everyone who listened to today's stories. If you liked it, please like and subscribe. If you haven't already, feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments. Take care.